Good morning and welcome. I'm Erica Moultrie with Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation. I'm the Director of Operations and Strategy, and we are so glad to have you here with us for yet another opportunity to learn about the history of race and racism, with a focus today on our Asian American community, our family. And so I'm very excited that our Director of Communications, Stephanie Drenka, is going to take you through a tour of the history of race and racism specific to the Asian American community. I'll remind you that Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, our mission is about creating a radically inclusive city by addressing race and racism through narrative change, relationship building, and equitable policies and practices, with the vision that there is no North or South division existing in terms of race, wealth, arts, culture, health, safety, education, and opportunity, and communities actively, honestly, and openly acknowledge, repair, and heal from its past and present racial inequities. Our guiding principles are started in the place that we want to make sure that we are telling the truth and that it is all grounded in the history. And so today, you are very fortunate to get the opportunity to spend time with our own Stephanie Drenka. So at this time, I want to have Stephanie come on board. Come on, Stephanie, come on down and enjoy the history of race and racism specific to the Asian American community.
I just got kicked off of Zoom for a second. Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen. Thank you, Erica. All right. Welcome, everyone. And this is, again, as Erica said, the history of race in Dallas continued. There is a first part that is on our YouTube channel and our Facebook Live that Jerry Hawkins, our executive director, presented last year. Erica already went through our mission, so I'm going to go ahead and skip past that because we have a lot to cover. But if you would like to join the conversation on social media, our username is DallasTRHT. Mine is Stephanie Drenka, and you can use the hashtag #HowWeHeal. The first guiding principle of our TRHT framework is that there must be an accurate recounting of history, both local and national. So that is why we are offering this today, and specifically with everything that is happening in the country and the anti-Asian hate that has been gaining more of the media spotlight. We always start with a land and people acknowledgement for all of our presentations and our meetings. And the first acknowledgement is that Dallas is on stolen land. We are on the land of the Caddo and the Wichita and the Comanche and the American Indian tribes that stewarded this land for centuries before we came. Dallas was built with stolen labor. The city was built and thrives today because of exploited stolen labor from Black slaves, and we are still suffering from the consequences of that today. Because we are talking specifically about Dallas history and people of Asian descent, it's also important to acknowledge that imperialism, war, capitalist expansion, and colonialism facilitated the transnational movement of Asians. Another thing that I need to include in this presentation is a content warning. This is going to have racial slurs, imagery that is racist, hate speech, rape and sexual assault, violence towards women and people of color, death and war. The history of racism in Dallas in this country is ugly and it is triggering. And with everything that is going on today, this week alone, it's important that you're ready to see this. And if you're not, we are going to be recording this and uploading it later. Another thing that I need to mention is this is not an exhaustive list of Asian history in Dallas. Asia is a very large continent, and we have many different stories and many different histories. And so this is going to be just a small snippet of Asian history in Dallas. And we are not even getting to the Pacific Islanders, and Asian Pacific American Heritage Month is in May. So I encourage you to look for opportunities. We will continue this conversation and make it more inclusive as we go on. Another thing that I need to cover before we start is race. We are talking about Asians as a race, but race is a political construct, and it was created by pseudoscientists like Blumenbach here, who used the phrase Oriental to describe Asians, and also created this social hierarchy. So that's why we don't use words like Oriental or Caucasian. We say white, we say Asian America. And it's also important to note that race is not ethnicity. So it's not the shared cultural heritage of a group. It's not nationality, the country that you were born in or belong to. And most importantly, it's not set in stone. And we'll see that with Asian American history, especially. There is a hierarchy with white on the top and black on the bottom, but everyone in between fluctuates based on the needs of the dominant group. I will be using the phrase Asian American because it is a powerful political label that was created in 1968 by student organizers who wanted to come up with a term that would be an umbrella term for all larger groups. And they coined the group Asian American Political Alliance. And so that is the language that we still use today because it gives sort of a collective power to our people. I'm going to start this history with the first recorded Asian Texan, who was a Filipino man named Francisco Flores, who was on a Spanish ship and stopped at Port Isabel in Texas and decided to make it his home. He stayed and moved his fishing business to Rockport and lived to the age of 108. But he would tell his family in his later years that he never met another Filipino during all his travels or during his life in Texas. So Filipino history, we're going to cover a little bit later, but I had to shout out Francisco for being the first Asian Texan. That's another thing that I need to say before we go into the presentation. This is not necessarily in chronological order. The history of Asian Americans in Dallas is, for a lot of us, more recent just because of immigration laws that excluded us for years, for centuries. And so everything is kind of fluctuating, but I'm going to cover as much as I can in the span of an hour and hopefully leave time for questions. So I'm going to start with the Asian history that most of us are taught, which is the history of Chinese people and Chinese railroad workers specifically, who were some of the first immigrants to come. And so specifically in Texas, we had about 250 Chinese Americans and immigrants that arrived in Galveston, Texas in 1870. So a lot of these railroad workers had just finished the first transcontinental railroad of the US, which was the Central Pacific Railroad. And some of them were contracted then to work on the second railroad, which was Houston and Texas Central Railroad. As they began immigrating and working on the railroad, there were discussions that the Chinese could be the new slaves of the South. So this time frame is post-Civil War. Slavery is now abolished, and people are trying to figure out how to manage that labor that was once exploited with stolen labor. As Chinese arrived in Texas, so did racism. There was an editorial published in the Dallas Herald that said, "We want neither N-word nor Mongolians. We want white men, men created in their maker's image." Many white and Black people saw Chinese as replacement workers. So as the rail workers, those Chinese men came from San Francisco to Galveston, they were actually met at each stop by Black protesters who were afraid that they were going to be taking their jobs. Railroad moguls, the men in charge, were adept at playing ethnic groups against each other. This is a pattern that we see happening even today. So if the Chinese men would go on strike, they would threaten to replace them with newly emancipated slaves. Or if lower income white workers, for example, on the East Coast in factories threatened to strike, then they would use Chinese American labor to counteract that. So Asians as what we call a middleman minority and a racial wedge has been throughout our history. It's another thing about Chinese and Asian immigration in Dallas is that a lot of the things that happen in other places of the country also impact us. One of the largest examples of anti-Asian violence happened in 1871 in Los Angeles, in a Chinatown area where there was some rival Chinese gangs that got in a shootout. Eventually, a committee of vigilance was formed, and a mob of 500 white men rioted and rounded up every Chinese man and boy. They took them to the gallows, and they made makeshift gallows and hung 18 Chinese victims. 10% of the Chinese population was killed from that city. And of the people that were killed, only one was thought to have participated in the original gunfight. You'll notice that a lot of the history in the slides so far has been about Chinese men. This is because one of the very first immigration laws that explicitly prohibited people based on race was the Page Act of 1875. This was targeted at Chinese women who at the time were perceived as a sexual threat and stereotyped as promiscuous or prostitutes, language that we've seen again today. And even Chinese women who were working in the sex industry were singled out and specifically accused of spreading sexually transmitted diseases. So the Page Act prohibited the recruitment of laborers from China, Japan, or any Oriental country who were brought for lewd or immoral purposes, i.e. prostitution. But what it was used was a way to prevent Chinese women altogether from migrating. And so they would, Chinese women would immigrate to the United States. They would be detained at Angel Island and put through horrific medical exams and interrogation. You'll see etchings that were carved into the walls in the detention center, poems and experiences that they went through during their time there. Women were forced to strip naked for medical exams, defecate on command. It ended up being so traumatizing that Chinese women just didn't try to come to America at all. And that left Chinese men as bachelors. Because of anti-miscegenation laws, they weren't able to marry outside of their race. And they also didn't have Chinese women to marry. And so they were then portrayed as driftless bachelors, sort of these dangerous single men and a threat to white women. And so that eventually led to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which was the first significant law restricting immigration into the United States. It provided an absolute 10-year moratorium on Chinese immigration. And it was the first federal law prescribing entry of an ethnic working group on the premise that it endangered the good order of certain localities. So Chinese people were a threat, and that is why they weren't allowed to immigrate. And so that's why in Dallas, it was news when there were Chinese immigrants, when they were either deported, when they were caught sneaking in. And there was very few Chinese people living in the city in those days. J.L. Chow was the first Asian to be listed in Dallas's city directories. He boarded at the Central Hotel and opened Chow Chow Laundry at 904 Elm Street in 1874. By 1886, there were 14 other Chinese laundries that opened. Many were only open for 2 years at best. Unlike other cities, Chinese people in Dallas didn't congregate into Chinatowns. They were dispersed through the central business district. This is a modern day photo of what would have been the area that Chow Chow Laundry was. Shops were along Ross, Pacific, Ackers, Swiss Avenue, Main, Market Street. Others opened stores in South Dallas and Oak Cliff. By 1891, there were 34 Chinese individuals in the city directory, all identified as laundry proprietors or laundrymen, with the exception of a few. And by 1890, there were 63 persons of Chinese descent. In 1891, 41 out of 49 laundries in Dallas were Chinese owned. But the prevalence of the Chinese laundries also caused more racism. And there was propaganda campaigns initiated against Chinese laundries by white competitors. So this is an example of an ad that was published in the Texas State Gazetteer, and Business Director in 1890, and it was from Eureka Steam Laundry, one of the white-owned laundries. And they said, "The Chinese must go." There was also an editorial published by the Dallas Daily Times Herald, "Danger in Inferior Laundries." Dallas customers cannot be too careful where they send their soiled laundries. So the white laundries of Dallas are complaining that the patronage of many of the people who can afford to patronize their institutions are often sending them to the inferior Chinese laundries of the city. The employees of the inferior laundries referred to run the risk of contracting some vile disease. So as we go through the presentation, I'm hoping that you'll start to hear some of this language and the stereotypes that are happening still today. The news would portray Chinese people as criminal, primitive, diseased. So around 1898, most Chinese laundries chose to open grocery stores and restaurants. They couldn't afford to keep their laundries in business. This is an example of a former Chinese laundry that was purchased by a wealthy family and ended up becoming sort of a socialite gathering spot and was highlighted and featured in many of the local papers. An article in July of 1952 in the Dallas Morning News, the owners were interviewed and they said, "A 600-year-old Buddha presides over the transit enclosed garden of Mr. and Mrs. Walter Scruggs Caruth at 3610 Congress. This is as it should be, say the Caruths, for why shouldn't a Chinaman be at home in an ex-laundry?" This is 3610 Congress today. Realtor.com estimates it at over $1 million in value. Modern day Chinese immigration to Dallas after the 1934 repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, more students and merchants came. Dallas-Fort Worth became a popular location, not only because of the DFW airport, but because of all of the telecommunications companies that were here. So Nortel Networks, Alcatel, Texas Instruments were large employers of Chinese immigrants. By 1983, 20,000 Chinese people lived in Dallas, 5,000 in Richardson, where an Asian commercial district developed. And so this is a look at modern day Richardson's Chinatown, where there's restaurants and grocery stores and businesses. Filipinos in Texas, Francisco, even though he was the only Filipino for a long while, was eventually joined in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But as I said in one of those earlier slides, war has always been sort of a driver of transnational migration of Asians, specifically to the US. So in December 1898, the US purchased the Philippine Islands from Spain, but the Filipinos had already declared independence from Spain in June. They had been fighting a long war with Spain. But the US decided that they purchased them from Spain. They were going to colonize them. They conquered the Philippines eventually in a bloody war that lasted from 1898 to 1913. During the war, US soldiers and government officials hired Filipinos as workers and brought them back to the United States. Filipino houseboys, for example, talked about in the Dallas Morning News, described as remarkably good looking with a bright black eye and an intelligent countenance. The US Census counted 6 Filipinos in Texas in 1910, 30 in 1920, and in 1930, 246 males and 42 females. The number of Filipinos in Texas increased after 1948. The US established the exchange visitor program, which was to fill a need for professionals, specifically nurses. So in the 1950s and 1960s, an increasing number of Filipino professionals settled in Texas. By early 2000s, the number of Filipino and Filipino American nurses working in the Houston area specifically was about 4,000. But with this also comes more racism and violence. A Filipino nurse in Dallas was raped and killed in her apartment. These are article screenshots from the Dallas Morning News. And the person that committed the crimes had also been arrested for 4 burglaries, an aggravated robbery, and there were other charges. He was a suspect in numerous rape cases. Filipino immigrants were also exploited by this man, the associate superintendent, the Garland ISD human resources director, who recruited teachers from the Philippines in the early 2010s, charged them money for a chance to interview, and then an additional orientation fee of $4,000 to $5,000, which he then kept to himself. The associate superintendent knew about the program for at least a year before an investigation started. And the worst part of it was after that, the teachers faced deportation because they had been working in the district for years, thinking that all of the paperwork had been taken care of by the human resources director, and they weren't. This picture of the Cotton Bowl might seem like a non sequitur, but it's important because in the 1900s, Dallas became the largest inland cotton market in the world. And it also attracted attention from outside America, specifically Japan. So the Japan Cotton Company decided to occupy space in the Dallas Cotton Exchange building in the late 1920s and came to trade and buy Dallas's cotton. The employees of the Japan Cotton Company were also some of the first to be interned and detained during World War II after Pearl Harbor. And so this is a picture from Dallas Morning News. Dallas Japs questioned was the headline there. So this is another photo of them before they were sent to Seagoville, which is a detention center that's just about 20 miles away from Dallas. This picture from the Associated Press was a detective that had taken all of their possessions and their belongings and taken them into custody. The caption from the Associated Press was, "This is a portion of the contraband radios, cameras, guns that were seized during all-night raids on residents of enemy aliens in Dallas County." This is a picture of Seagoville. The picture on the right is the huts that many of the Japanese internees lived in, and that's a picture of it as it is today at the bottom. And that's kind of how close we are to it right now. Anti-Japanese sentiment was everywhere, including in Dallas Morning News. There was an interview with a Texas Marine who said killing Japs was like killing rats. Another US flyer said that Japanese pilots, it was like killing doves. The public was asked to report Japanese aliens to the FBI. SMU canceled their production of Madame Butterfly. And there were also some issues with Dallas policemen having trouble with the unfamiliar Oriental countenance, and that 2 persons of Asiatic appearance picked up by city detectives turned out to be Filipinos. The police search also developed Koreans. This led to a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment even within the Asian community. So a Chinese former soldier, for example, was interviewed and said he wanted to kick Japs in the pants. There was a lot of talk about Dallas Chinese people hoping for a victory over Japan. Hideo Muta was a business owner whose store was forced to close, but his neighbors and friends signed a petition vouching for his staunch American patriotism. So he was spared internment and ended up being a proud member of the Dallas Chamber of Commerce for over 25 years. He wrote in a newspaper ad, "Thank you, Dallas friends. They've been wonderful to us. Their expressions of friendship and confidence have made us very happy. The United States has licensed us to continue business. So a happier story of allyship back in the day from him. This is Benny Ogata, who was a Dallas resident and a second generation Japanese American. And he decided to enlist in the army and was deployed to Italy with his troop. He was a proud member of the 2nd Battalion of the 442nd Infantry Regiment. And so they were an all Nisei, all Japanese American Army regiment. And their motto was "Go for Broke," which originated with the Hawaiian All Nisei Battalion, which later merged with them. And it meant, to bet all one's money on one throw of the dice. So they were known for their reckless abandon and as fierce fighters. Benny was awarded a Purple Heart and died in a battle against the Germans in Italy. Koreans in Texas have another story of being here because of a war in their home country, and also sort of a later immigration pattern, again, because of the exclusionary immigration laws. So as late as 1970, the census recorded only 2,090 Koreans in the state, which has increased since then. And there's actually, if you look at this historical marker, that's in Carrollton, which is where the sort of Koreatown has developed, with H Mart and several restaurants and retail spots there. And it talks about the history of Korean Texans. Many of the early Korean immigrants were war brides. So because of the Korean War, many of the soldiers who fought in the Korean War met Korean women, married them, and were allowed to bring them back to the United States. There was a 2-to-1 ratio of Korean women and men in Texas in the 1980 census, but a high portion of US military Korean marriages ended in divorce. And this is a really important example of how American US military presence has shaped immigration and also exploited women. It's happening today, even now. The earliest sort of prostitution camps were set up in Korea after the Korean War, and they still happen today. And a lot of the Korean war brides who came to the States had trouble acclimating. There were cultural differences. This is an example from a Fort Worth couple. The US soldier deserted his Korean war bride and their 2 children, leaving them to starve. Neighbors found her sitting quietly in her apartment waiting for death. They hadn't eaten for 2 days. Problematic issues with the militarization and war bride phenomenon. Korean adoption was also started after the Korean War, and Dallas was home to a lot of the Korean orphans. These are some snapshots. Korean orphans that were adopted in Dallas became sort of darlings of the newspaper. So they would often be photographed. The families would get together for luncheons and the press would be there. There was a story of an Army sergeant who talked about his adopted Korean child saying, "My daughter Olga wrote me that she would like to have a Korean sister for a present. I kind of always wanted another little girl anyway." One adoptee recalled being in the orphanage in Korea and the orphanage having events that were sponsored by the military. So there was a lot of military presence in the orphanages that led to the adoptions later. Later, Korean immigrants were entrepreneurs, professionals. A lot of students came to study here and stayed, became professors, etc. But a lot of the Korean families opened mom and pop businesses, so gas stations, convenience stores, liquor stores, a lot of places that didn't require a lot of English, and also in lower income areas because they were immigrants trying to, start in a new country and didn't have a lot of capital. And so they were in areas that were predominantly populated by Black communities, Latinx communities. This brought a lot of tensions, specifically, and one of the most well-known cases was in LA during the 1990s, the LA riots. Saigu is the Korean word for the LA riots. It literally means 429. April 29th was the day that most people think of as the beginning of the LA riots, but the tensions had been building long before that. So in LA, a Korean American shopkeeper named Soon Ja-do had fatally shot and killed a 15-year-old Black girl named Latasha Harlins, only received a sentence of 5 years probation and 400 hours of community service. This was one example of anti-Blackness in the Asian and Korean community. The riots happened after a video was released of Rodney King being beaten by LAPD officers and their acquittal in April 1992. South Los Angeles was one of the focal points of the riots, predominantly inhabited by Black people, but most of the businesses were Korean Americans. More than 2,200 Korean businesses were looted, damaged, or completely destroyed. This is some footage of the aftermath of the LA riots and an image that went viral of a Korean store owner trying to protect his store from the rooftop. This was not limited to LA, however. There were also reports of boycotts of Korean businesses in all of these cities, Dallas included. One incident that caused a boycott in the DFW area was when a Korean store owner named Jason No chased after and shot Daryl Bivens, a man he suspected of shoplifting. There was also an incident even as recently as 2012, where a Black man was shot by a Korean convenience store owner. Mayor Rawlings intervened. There was also some activists that got together and worked to repair and heal some of the community's divides. But what's important to also understand is that the Korean business store owners were in a state of trauma from heightened fear from robberies, murders. For example, in 2009, the owner of a donut shop, a Korean man, was shot during a robbery, and his shooters were never found. His daughter used to write letters to the homicide detective. One of the letters said, "Even though you're not Santa Claus, the wishes for my Christmas is that for you to find the criminals who murdered my dad." Vietnamese Americans and sort of the next wave of immigration is another example of immigration being because of war and strife in the origin country. So Vietnamese Americans compose the largest refugee population in the post-World War II area. Texas is the second largest Vietnamese American population in the nation. From 1978 to the mid-1980s, an estimated 1 to 2 million Vietnamese people left the country by boat. They were called boat people in quotation mark. It was a very dangerous escape. There was high death tolls. So the United Nations created the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, created an orderly departure program, the ODP, to assist Vietnamese refugees in emigrating in a systematic, orderly, legal manner. So they helped over 500,000 Vietnamese refugees immigrate to the US, including to Texas. Another government operation was Operation Baby Lift, which was initiated to bring South Vietnamese orphans to the United States for adoption by American parents. It lasted 10 days. Eventually 2,600 children were transported. But the very first flight that took off crashed right after takeoff and killed 138 of the passengers, mostly children. These are some other pictures of Operation Baby Lift. Hugh Hefner had donated one of his private planes for the operation. And so on the right, you'll see some of his Playboy bunnies holding the children after the flight. there was another wave of refugee resettlement, and East Dallas eventually became known as Little Asia. So Little Asia, for example, in May 1986, Dallas Morning News described the 20 square block area of East Dallas is disturbed by back alley crime and the unfulfilled dreams of 4,000 Indo-Chinese refugees. Streetwise toughs roam its neighborhoods. Resentment over the intrusion of a foreign culture ruffles many Blacks who were here first and the Hispanics who were second. The Asian refugees are left wondering whether this is in fact the promised land. And so not only were refugees escaping horror from their home countries, the largest of this group was Cambodian refugees who were escaping the terror of the Khmer Rouge. But then they also had to come to America and face racism and racial tensions between different communities. This is an article about Little Asia, the Far East in East Dallas, talking about the large refugee population. And it was described, drive along North Fitzhugh just before sundown. Playing around the apartment houses will be hundreds of Oriental children. From the Singha Siam grocery at 2636 North Fitzhugh to the Vietnam Market #2 at Fitzhugh's intersection with Ross is a concentration of Oriental residents that has developed so quietly as to have gone almost unnoticed. So even in the 1980s, we were still describing Asian people as Orientals in our mainstream newspapers. And we now know Little Asia as an area called Vickery Meadow. Vickery Meadow has been home to refugees and new immigrants from around the world for decades, but the enclave is on the cusp of major change. More and more big box and higher end development are sprouting up around the neighborhood's perimeter, and residents fear that the heart of Vickery Meadow will be transformed. So we know what East Dallas looks like today and what residents are facing and gentrification. And so can't forget the history and who is being displaced when development comes in. It's also important to remember the people that didn't even make it to the country. There were thousands of refugees in Thailand that were waiting in camps to be interviewed and eventually forced to return to the country because of the caps that we have in the country about how many refugees we accept. So refugees would wait in these camps to be interviewed, and they would have to prove that their story and their skills and background were sort of in the matched US's interests. This is a trend that we've seen over time, year after year, affecting different populations, who gets to come into the country, who's excluded, and always based on the benefit for us or fear and stereotypes and prejudice. So in modern day times, Executive Order 13769, also known as the Muslim ban or the travel ban. On January 27, 2017, President Trump signed an executive order that banned travel to the United States for 90 days from 7 predominantly Muslim countries. It was also upheld by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 ruling. The director of ACLU's Immigrants' Rights Project said, "This ruling will go down in history as one of the Supreme Court's great failures. It repeats the mistakes of the Korematsu decision upholding Japanese American imprisonment." And what was really terrifying and alarming during this was that the advocates for the Muslim ban were actually using Japanese internment as precedent and justifying the Muslim ban with internment, even though it was something that we should have learned from and agreed as a collective that it should never happen again. George Takei, who was a survivor of the internment camps, also talked about its ties to family separation at the border in recent years. On his first day in office, President Joe Biden reversed Donald Trump's bans on immigrants. And there's also a proposed No Ban Act, which would rein in the Immigration and Nationality Act provision. for the future. Which brings us to today, the last few years under Trump and with COVID and the global pandemic. Stop AAPI Hate started reporting anti-Asian hate incidents. Texas ranked 4th in anti-Asian incidents. In San Antonio, an Asian restaurant was graffitied with "Go Back to China" and the words "Kung Flu" on the windows. Between March 20th and February 2021, more than 3,795 incidents of anti-Asian hate were recorded. At least 103 of those incidents were in Texas, and Texas also has 20% of the cases that were physical assaults. And these are also underreported statistics, but it's a snapshot of how dire the situation is. June 2020, a Dallas Stars employee was fired after posting on Nextdoor comparing Chinese people to squirrels. He said, "When you shoot a squirrel, it stops that one and also stops it from breeding to create more squirrels year after year. These squirrels are like the Chinese. They just keep coming. It's not enough for 1 or 2 people to be shooting them. We'll all need to do our part to make a difference." Again, that was June 2020. And then fast forward to 2021, the shooting in Atlanta, where 6 out of the 8 victims were Korean women. After years of Donald Trump saying China flu and Kung flu and China virus and blaming Chinese people for the global pandemic that we're in, increasing media coverage of anti-Asian hate crimes, including one recently where a woman was being beaten and the security guard closed the door and didn't intervene. Even again, within our own Asian communities, a woman named Siri Kim, who is running for Texas's 6th congressional district, said about Chinese people, "I don't want them here at all. They steal our intellectual property. They give us coronavirus. They don't hold themselves accountable. And quite frankly, I can say that because I'm Korean." Harkening back to the days of World War II, where Chinese were saying they wanted to kick Japs in the pants, and this constant turning against each other so that we feel like we're protected by white people, when really we're just harming ourselves and each other. I threw this graphic in, this screenshot from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, to lighten the mood just a little bit because a lot of this has been so heavy. My team was joking with me when they saw my abundance of notes preparing for this presentation that I was this crazy person. But I think it's really important to understand how all of these events and all of our oppression has been tied to each other, not just within different Asian American communities, but across the board. And history is continually repeating itself because we aren't learning from it. So that is the end of my official presentation. Here are some recommended reading and resources, because again, this was not an exhaustive list of history, and we have so much more to learn from each other, from the untold stories. And I'm going to open it up for questions. I need to pull up Facebook, but Erica, if you want to pop back in, if you've been monitoring the Facebook chat or anything, but I'll go ahead and stop sharing right now.
First, let me say thank you. This is amazing history, and I wish that you could see the Facebook chat for all the appreciation of bringing the history to Dallas and people wanting to learn so much more. So we have, or yes, I'm going to say we have a lot of opportunities to be able to present information, more information around this history. Just a few little comments that are there. Good work. Thank you. One of the best concise whole story presentations. Thank you for doing this. Again, thank you so much. All your prep. Wait a minute. It's going. There's a lot going, and notes are worth it.
There's so much more.
Phenomenal.
I couldn't
Thank you so much.
I couldn't fit it all in.
No, we couldn't get it all. So we didn't have very many. You didn't have any questions that came up at all. I guess I would have a question for you. Like, where do we go from here? What do we do with this information? And, what do people need to be talking about at this point and sharing at this point when it comes to this history?
The biggest thing that I want people to take away is how history repeats itself with different groups, and it's always at the benefit of white supremacy. And the media, again, the LA riots, I always kind of harken back to that, but the pitting of Asian Americans against other communities of color is a strategy and it's a tactic. The model minority myth in particular was weaponized after the civil rights movement because Black people were gaining too much power. And so they held up Asian Americans on this imaginary pedestal to say, like, if Asian Americans can do this, then you can too. There's a lot of cultural strife between Black and Asian communities, and we have to be conscious of that today. The media is choosing which anti-Asian hate incidents to show, and a lot of the video footage and the photos that are being released are perpetrated by people of color against Asians, even though the majority of anti-Asian incidents and violence is perpetrated by white people. And so again, the same kind of language about Black Korean tension and race riots and that we saw in the LA riots, I'm afraid will happen again with this new sort of spotlight on anti-Asian violence.
Yeah. So we did have a couple questions that just came up. Do you have any thoughts or insights on how Asian history has affected Asian American history? For example, relations between Asian countries.
Yeah, I think that's what's one of the most unique things about Asian Americans in our history is that it's always so closely tied to what's happening in our countries. Like the Japanese internment is the perfect example. Japanese Americans, 3/4 of the people that were interned were American citizens, and that precariousness of being American and citizenship when we're tied so closely to our countries of origin. Again, there was Trump and his sort of war on immigration and citizenship, the naturalization, like even Korean adoptees, for example. I'm a citizen, but there's 20,000 Asian adoptees and adult adoptees who did not have the correct paperwork, who are now not citizens of this country and at risk for deportation. And there's so many examples of that. But yes, our history is always tied to what's happening in our countries of origin. And that's, again, why we have the perpetual foreigner stereotype, why I'm asked continuously, where are you really from? Because people can't accept that we are from here and that we're American. It's always the othering and our connections to our home country.
Mm-hmm. Well, Stephanie, I want to thank you again. This was a great presentation. Thank you so much for bringing this history to Dallas. Thank you for bringing it to Dallas TRHT. For those who are watching and participating, visit our website, dallastrht.org. There is so much information that we are providing, and we will continue to have these conversations. We'll continue to expand the history. There's no way that in 1 hour we can get it all there, but we will continue, and we are committed to making sure that there's a narrative change and that we are sharing the history. You can visit us on all social media at Dallas TRHT, hashtag Dallas TRHT. Stephanie taught me all of this stuff. Hashtag how we heal. We want to be able to do that. So I really want you all to go out there and recognize Stephanie for all of her awesomeness. And thanks, Stephanie, one more time. Everybody have a great day.